Previously on Classroom Hacks.
I'll give one specific one that because it is so specific and is so odd, but in a good way, that it's a short one, so don't worry. So in philosophy, when we do, there's a branch of philosophy known as epistemology, which is discussing theories of knowledge and truth and so forth. And I had a student come up to me at the end of the semester, and she said to me that learning that knowledge is basically justified true belief, and it's not a perfect definition, Gettier problems notwithstanding. She said that learning about what knowledge is, or just having a better idea of what it is, helped her get over a breakup. And I was like, wait, what? I've never been told this before. She said because she had all these thoughts and beliefs about her boyfriend and about their relationship, that when she examined them and took the time to contemplate them, she realized that a lot of her beliefs about him or about the relationship were not justified. In other words, that she began to realize, wait, we weren't a good fit for each other. The breakup isn't a bad thing.
Good morning, everybody. It is August 6th, Monday, and this is episode 14 of Classroom Hacks, titled Criticism. I'm Eric Tan, joined by
Peter Canetis, once again. And
perhaps you may have forgotten who we are, but we are live from the Pantheon of Pedagogy, the Mecca of Methodology, your vacation from vacation with your academic all-stars, where you can learn to seriously take teaching not so seriously. This is and we are Classroom Hacks. Pedro, welcome back.
Good to see you as always. You look good today.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Well, I hate to qualify it by saying today, as if I mean you look. The other days you look like garbage.
Well, there's no other way to take that. And
I'm sorry. You are a handsome man.
And I think it's always been funny to me for people who do take it in that direction, where when you tell them, "Oh, you look nice today. That's a nice shirt," and they say, "Well, I don't look nice any other day."
And you're like, "No, that's not what I meant.
So.
Because what are you supposed to say? Mm-hmm. What's the alternative? Like, say we show up to work one morning, mm-hmm. and someone says, "You look nice." I guess they could say just that.
Yeah. Or they just say, "You look," and then they just leave it ambiguous.
And then they run.
Yeah. And you don't know how to take that. I could see not knowing how to take that. We're talking about criticism. And no matter how fast you run, how far you travel, or how well you hide, seemingly no one can go through life avoiding some sort of criticism, feedback, or evaluation. Conversely, as educators, at some point throughout your career, you will most likely have to administer some sort of criticism in your own classroom. And so today we're talking about how we handle tougher criticism, how do we stay mindful when managing criticism in our classes. And so we're looking at these sort of two inescapable pillars of education today. And so for you, Pedro, the first question of today is, what are some of the points of criticism you have received that have stuck out to you in your mind outside of education? So beyond these walls of academia, what are some points of criticism you have received that stick out to you the most?
Well, as I've mentioned before, and as we've talked about, my background in theater and in acting, and of course, as you know, there's a lot of rejection there because you audition for so many things, and oftentimes you don't get cast. And so you have to develop a thick skin. If you don't, then it's going to be too hard of a road to travel down. And I'll be honest with you, it's not like oftentimes there's still the disappointment of not being cast, because oftentimes you don't get the feedback. They see the audition many people, and they can't sit there and call, email, write a letter to everybody saying, "Here's why you didn't get it." Sometimes it's you didn't have a good audition. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it has nothing to do with that. Sometimes you gave a great audition, you're just not right for the role. But you're on the other end of it, and you're not sure of what the reason is. And so that in some ways is tougher because your mind can play tricks on you, and sometimes you can think the worst and say, "Oh, I don't have talent," or "Oh, I'm not good enough," or et cetera, et cetera. And so that's one end of when there's a lack of feedback that can be tough. Now, with specific feedback, sometimes, I say in acting class, when you get feedback from a teacher, and some teachers just lay it out straight right at you, and as they say, they stab you in the front, which oftentimes can be a good thing because they're being honest. And so we have to make up our minds whether or not to, as they say, stay or flee. Like, do I stay in this? Do I keep pursuing this? Or do I take this criticism and pack up and go home? Like, you hear many success stories in any field, science, the arts, medicine, etc., sports. People will get bad feedback or have setbacks and then turn that into a strength and turn that into, okay, I'm going to take this, because as we know, oftentimes, not to sound too cliche here, but the road to success is paved with failure and mistakes and hard knocks, as they say. So I feel like I'm talking too much. I'm going to pass it over to you.
No, never ever feel like you have a ceiling on how much you can talk on this.
It all started when I was 7 years old, and then when I was 8. Okay.
The day began as 12 birds flew by my window.
When I was born, I was very young.
I think 2 points of criticism that have stuck out to me and relatively contrastive outside of academia were from my father and when I was working in sales in Bloomingdale's. My dad was always the type of person who always said, if you can do something for yourself, by yourself, do it yourself. Don't rely on other people. And I know that growing up, I would sometimes question, well, why do we need to change the oil in the car? Or why do we need to try to fix the sub pump? There's people we can hire to do that. And he's like, no. And aside from being relatively cheap, he always was one of those hands-on sort of do-it-yourself people. And so he was more of the criticism of criticizing my failed understanding of not needing to rely on people, and then also showing me how to do these certain things. And whether or not he did them correctly, he was a shower and not a teller. So he would show me how to change the oil in the car, show me how to change a sub pump, show me how to fix different things. Well, I was probably closer to when I was getting my first car. So I probably changed the oil in the car maybe when I was 12 or 13. And then when I got my first car, then I was just changing my own oil in my car for that. The second example I have in terms of criticism is the contrast to that when I was in sales. And I remember when I transitioned into sales, I didn't have a commission-based background. I had never worked in a strictly commission-based environment. I came from shipping and receiving, so a lot of times my tools were logistically based. I knew how to obviously do merchandising and inventory and ship things and do a lot of physical manual labor when it came to unloading and loading trucks. But when it came to sales, I had absolutely no background on that. And so one of the things they came after the first quarter reviews came back was, well, your sales are down. You need to sell more. That was really the extent of the advice that was there. It wasn't very in-depth. It wasn't very clear and detailed as to how I could become a better salesperson. So utilizing the tools that I got from my father, I ended up just sort of sitting back and watching some of the better salespeople on the floor and saw how they sold. And it was, we talked about in a previous episode, I learned about telling the story, making the story fit for the type of customer and not necessarily worrying so much about selling the product, but selling the idea of the product to the customer. And when it comes to, say, negative sort of criticism, Pedro, because anyone can deal with positive reviews, as we sort of talked about in our previous episode of what makes it worth it. But when it comes to negative criticism, what have been some of the better means of management and coping and handling of some of those negative and tougher bits of criticism that you received? How have you dealt with those things?
Well, after weeping for 2 hours on the floor in the fetal position with a gallon of ice cream, I got up off the floor. Now, I don't know about you. I'll speak for myself here, saying that it's not like I'm past the point of getting negative feedback from students. Do you mean just students or anybody?
Just anybody. Anybody, whether it was from students, administrators, previous bosses, just negative criticism in general, or harsher criticism in general. How have you sort of dealt with it?
If possible, and this is not always possible, but if possible, I'd like to talk to the person that gave the feedback. I want to understand why. I want to hopefully learn from the experience. I don't mean to talk to them so I can defend myself and say, you're wrong, but more so, say it's from my administrator who evaluates the class. Well, then, of course, we're going to sit down and talk with them because it's part of the process. They evaluate, they write it down, we discuss it. But if it's from somebody else, I would love to to have the opportunity to find out more. As we know, when it comes from students, say in the end of the semester evaluations, some teachers evaluate on their own. You do this, don't you, during the semester? You send out
do midterm evaluations for my own classes.
Yeah, and these are not official. They're not school sanctioned. They're just, I think that's a very good idea to do that, by the way. Because sometimes when you give evaluations at the end of the semester, students are thinking, well, this won't make a difference for our class, obviously. Our class is over. This is for next semester. And again, those are valuable and those have their place as well. Probably the most significant instance of this was when I was evaluated years ago by one of the administrators here who gave me the feedback. So he sat in on one of my classes, and then we met afterwards, and he said that I was more teacher-centered than student-centered. And we talked about it, and he says, this is oftentimes the model that we're presented in our education. The teacher is the one who knows his or her stuff. We learn from them. We memorize it. We either are evaluated by an exam or we write papers, and that's it. So we just spit the information back out. And this administrator is the type that is a straight shooter. I mean, he is not the type for warm fuzzies. He would give it to you straight, which at the time feels like, oh, I'm being wounded. But I walked away very much appreciating it at the same time because it was very clear, very direct, very specific, and he gave me an action plan to pursue if I wanted to. He says, it's up to you, Pete, if you want to change your teaching or go to the next level, if you just want to stay where you're at. He says, but if you do, here are some steps to take. And so before then I thought, yeah, I'm a pretty good teacher, but then walking out after that evaluation I thought, man, I stink. And but I didn't, fortunately I didn't stay at the I stink. I'm like, you know what, wait a minute, it's not true that I'm terrible. And he wasn't saying that. He's saying, Pete, here are some weaknesses. Here are some areas where you need to improve. And I'm very grateful because it has made a difference for me and for my students.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to bring up, especially when keeping in mind that we are lifelong learners ourselves. And as learners, we have to be able to take any sort of criticism we have and turn that into a positive. And I'm not saying that you can't get down on yourself and you shouldn't feel what you're feeling. But at the same time, even if the criticism is harsher, even if the criticism is very concise, even if the criticism isn't as detailed, try to pick something out of that you can utilize to make your class experience better, make you a better teacher. One example that I have is that I remember that I was doing a lesson plan that I hadn't revised in a while, and I probably had done it 3 semesters in a row. I remember a student came up to me afterwards and was saying that, because it was an analysis lesson plan, and we had watched a clip, I believe, from a TV show, and I was trying to emphasize different characterization and things like that. And he said, I feel like it's interesting to watch these things, but I don't really feel challenged by it. And at first, I kind of took that as a shot at my teaching, but then I came back around and I said to myself, your student here is telling you that they're not feeling challenged, that he is not feeling challenged. So what can you do the next time you come around to challenge him, to challenge the class more? And in that, instead of just being down and saying, well, why should I be teaching? This isn't, my forte. It's, well, what can I do to raise the level of engagement, interaction, to challenge them even harder? And so I revised, I went back and I went through all my lesson plans, I updated all of them, I changed the topics, I redid different sort of experiences with what they could do in groups, individually, and I came back, and the next time around, he actually said, now that's the type of class I was thinking this was going to be. And that to me was the sort of validation I was looking for, especially when taking a criticism like that and turning it positive. When we come back from our break, we're going to talk about how we sort of implement our own criticism and feedback in our classes and what that might look like for those of you who are wondering how to do it in a different way, or a more effective, or a more direct or significant way, and we'll talk about that when we come back. Hello again, everyone. Classroom Hacks just wants to extend a warm and friendly thank you to all of you who continue to visit us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, And especially for those listening to us on SoundCloud, remember, you can find Classroom Hacks on all the aforementioned social media sites. There's new and exclusive content on there each and every day. So once again, thank you for all your support and helping us continue to grow. We hope to see you all in October at WOTE, where Classroom Hacks will be presenting, so keep an eye out for more information to come in these next few weeks. And we are back. And so for this half of the episode, we're going to address how we utilize criticism in our class, how we implement feedback with our assignments, with our students, with our discussions. Pedro, how do you implement criticism in your classroom? What has worked and what hasn't worked for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. What I try to do, look, we can do hours of a podcast on this topic. So much has been written and discussed on this issue. So I'll just offer a couple of nuggets here in our discussion. One thing I try to do, and this is not revolutionary, I'm sure a lot of people know this already and are doing it already, is of course, here's what's working and here's what's not. But what I mean by that, I mean this in a very particular way. I try to do what we do in improv class. In improv, like you say, watch an improv comedy show, maybe back in the day is Whose Line Is It Anyway? The rule is never say no or always say yes. What I mean by that is you always go along with what the other character has come up with. Now, how I apply it to feedback is I try to use, well, here, let me give a specific example. We were having a discussion in class the other day about something about Aristotle's Ethics, and a student responded during the discussion, and some of the things the student said were accurate, some things were not. And so what I did was, instead of saying, because this is on the spot now and it's in front of the class, instead of saying, well, this is the parts that are wrong, these are the parts that are right. And by the way, if someone does that, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that, but I wanted to keep the flow going because it was a discussion. So I said, I'll just call the student Joe. I said, Joe got us 60% there. Who wants to add the other 40%? Now they might be thinking, well, which is the 60 he got right, which is the 40 he got wrong? But in a class size of 30, there's going to be enough students typically that know what to add. Not always, but oftentimes there are. And so again, my goal in class is not, especially in discussions, is not perfection necessarily, but progress. It's the wrestling with the material. It's saying, okay, what's right, what's wrong? And sometimes, as we know, there are things that are there's one right answer and many wrong answers. But sometimes, as we know in discussions, there's many right answers, or there's no right answers. It depends on the question, it depends on the issue. So I'm trying to say, like, okay, or use a football analogy. I'll say, great answer. Sarah got us 30 yards down the field, or 10 yards down the field. So we got some, a good short gain there, or maybe even a long gain. Who wants to add to it? There's one piece more. So I try to say, okay, here's what we got. Who wants to add to it? I'm trying to make it to build community as much as possible, and that's just one tidbit to add. So that's it.
I thought that was a great line about progress over perfection. And I think that's really at the core of the growth argument over proficiency, especially in this day and age, because especially in the classes that we teach, we're not necessarily trying to say that these students need to be at this all-knowing proficient level, because a lot of this is introductory. A lot of this is getting them just to be able to try different things and express themselves in ways they might not have had. And I think the idea of progress is something that is an underlying theme throughout the semester, because we're not just trying to give them the answer, right? We're trying to get them to come to the answer and the solution through a means that is workable and is meaningful to them, especially because it's one of those things where, like Pedro said, there isn't a set standard for how someone should get there. A lot of times students think that, well, every student's going to figure this out the same way, when the truth is that students need to figure out their strengths and how they can learn from what makes them stronger as a learner and as someone who can comprehend this material through avenues and means that work for them. I know for me, one thing that I learned in grad school from a wise and knowing and cultured and learned instructor was always lead with the compliment. And I've learned this in sales as well. And so whenever I'm giving feedback in terms of a project or an essay, is that I will go through that. I'll obviously leave my annotations and things on the side, but when I give the final sort of summation of what I've read, it's always, this is what stuck out the most. These are the strong areas. This is what you do very well. This was effective. This is what worked. And then as we sort of talk about any criticism that you might sort of bookend that with should be constructive. If you're going to try to give them feedback in terms of what they could do differently, don't just give them the answer, but give them questions that potentially they could build on, that they could, when they respond to these questions, they are coming up with the answers themselves and not necessarily the answer you just want them to give. And so that has kind of been the way that I've approached my terms of feedback and sort of reciprocating what I might expect from them from a particular project.
Are there any specific examples of this that come to mind from a discussion or a time in class?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just recently in my last class, they're working on their group presentation arguments, and when they split up into groups, one of the things that I have them do, or actually that they've been kind of doing on their own, is breaking it up and delegating who's going to do what section, how they're going to do this. And one of the students who was working on the thesis or the argument of their actual essay was able to sort of summarize what each person's section was about. And I told him, I said, well, you have all the parts, kind of like Pedro said, where you've gotten us 30 yards down the field, or you gave us 60%. So you've kind of given me 75% of what everyone has had. So based on what they have given you and what you know already and the great job that they've done, you have your conclusion. And if you're concluding that you want your audience to get this out of your argument, then essentially your argument should be somewhat similar to that foundation of what you've introduced and what you've concluded. And from there, he was able to kind of think all those things through, and I could see it sort of unraveling for him. And he eventually came up with a thesis by the end of the class, and that's nice. That's what I was looking for.
That's nice. Let me ask you this. Here's one of the challenging moments in class. What do you do when you have a student who contributes something, whether it's written in a paper or a comment during a class, and it's just completely off? It's completely off. It's just way off, and there's not even a positive. There's nothing that they got right in their answer. How do you handle that?
Well, I think a lot of times, when I have the ability to sit down or talk with a student one-on-one, I usually try to take it. That's primarily from my tutoring background, that I would prefer just to have one-on-ones with students so I can kind of pick their brain and see their process and how they got to that particular answer. And so what I'll kind of do is, if a student gives me a response that's completely off base, I might initially ask, well, what did you assume the assignment was asking? What did you think I was asking for in this assignment, or what the book was asking, or what the prompt was asking? And then I'll have them explain it, and then I'll ask them, and so in response to that, why did you give the answer you gave? What do you think you were trying to respond to? And then I'll listen to that, and then I'll pick out and try to at least determine, okay, this is how they connected the dots in their head. My goal then is to sort of guide them back to saying, okay, these parts you definitely picked up on. This is correct. This is what we believe the article or the author or the prompt is asking for. But in this area, it seems like you've kind of gotten away from that. And so why do you think you respond to that? And how would you feel if you sort of focused in on this part of the discussion? And so trying to not completely dismiss their process, but trying to get them to sort of open up and see the area or direction you may want them to go in.
I think that's beautiful that you spend that time and show that attention and care. That's huge. That's great. And that really makes the student, or shows the student, that you care, and you're not just about a grade. You're about you're investing in them as people. That's great. And that takes a lot of time, and that shows, if you're taking that time with students individually, that goes a long way with building really good. That's why students take your classes. They repeat your classes, not repeat because they failed.
And they repeat and they fail.
Yeah, they just keep repeating because they keep getting Fs.
They just love me so much.
They keep taking you as teachers, because as a teacher, your classes, because of they see, man, this guy cares and he really wants to help me. But how about in a discussion when it's in front of everybody and the person says something like, Shakespeare was a wonderful Irish poet and, wrote many, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something completely off about Shakespeare.
Sure, yeah. Where you have a student who might feel they have certain knowledge of different things and they bring up something that's completely wrong. Like, how do you do that? How do you
so what do you say instead of, because if there's nothing, because you said you want to lead with a compliment, but if there's nothing to compliment,
right.
What do you say?
Well, depending on, I think, how much time we have in class, if it's one of those classes where we're in the middle of a discussion, I tend to either let other students respond first, and if it gets too out of hand, then I sort of intervene. But usually, if it's something where it's just completely off base, and I usually try to just respond with other questions, like, "Oh, man, that's interesting. Well, where did you hear that, and how did you come to that sort of information or conclusion?" And my goal is to never necessarily completely shoot down someone in class or to make someone feel like they are less than in any way. But I like to always try to at least have some sort of conversation so that they can kind of come to some of these conclusions on their own. And that's the biggest thing. And never just to call out anyone individually and make them feel a certain way about something, especially if they honestly feel like that information that they've had has been correct. And so it's not just about like, well, now it's time to correct you and make you look like an idiot, but it's also just to kind of see how they got there is what's more important to me.
Yeah, I really like the idea of offering it as a question. And I'll do that even sometimes when their answer is completely right. I'll turn to the class. And that way, it's amazing how the class can sometimes, there's like a self-correction that goes on.
Right, yeah.
Other students will say, like the other day, we were going over the answers to a quiz as a class, and someone confidently raised their hand. They gave a wrong answer, and
those are the best.
I know.
The confident wrong answers.
A confident wrong answer. And other students, I say, okay, how many people voted for that answer? How many people voted for different answers? We talk about it, and it's funny because by the end of the 3-4 minutes of that discussion, it was the students who worked it out together. And I'm not saying it always works out that way. I'm not saying it always works out in a way where it is either harmonious or
this organic
solution,
resolution come by the students.
Yeah, we only mention our good times here sometimes. Yeah, on this podcast, we say, oh yes, but no, we have days where the lesson plan just is like a lead balloon, just goes plop.
Yeah.
And other days it sings. But also, and this is something we've talked about in a previous podcast, is I try really hard from the beginning. I learned this. Let me give this disclaimer, and I've said this before. If I ever say anything on this podcast that is helpful or profound, it's 99.9% chance I got it from somebody else. I have very little original thought, and so anything that you might find helpful is I got from some. We stand on the shoulders of the giants who came before us.
Archie comics.
Yes.
Bazooka Joe.
Bazooka
rappers,
Joe.
Yeah.
Fortune Cookies.
Yeah.
Deep Thoughts by Jack Handy. I try from the beginning of the semester, from the very first day, to promote, and I did not make up this term, a culture of error. To heck with being right, as far as like during discussions, jump in there, get involved. I tell them we're in this together. It's not a competition like who gets it right and who gets it wrong. We're trying to get to truth. Philosophy isn't just about spewing opinions. Otherwise, what are they paying for? Just to come to class just to hear different opinions. We're hearing different viewpoints, but I'm trying to ask them and trying to figure out, are any of these true? Are any of these good? And of course, we don't all agree on that, and that's okay. We don't have to agree. But I do want it to be a place where they feel comfortable to say something and not be perfect. And I even say, guys, can we just all from now agree that we're not going to say everything right and everything perfectly, and we're going to be okay, we're going to survive, and let's practice in here in the classroom so when we get out there, outside the classroom, we'll be more prepared. It's the, again, I've said before, it's the old military expression, the more we sweat in training, the less we bleed in battle.
And that's, I think, a great piece of advice to end on. The idea of a culture of error reminds me of a quote I heard this morning, and I forget who it was from, and it's probably a more famous one, but more dreams have been lost on doubt than they have on failure. And I think that idea of students just knowing that criticism, feedback, failure are not bad things. And same thing for us educators. They're not bad things. Take them, learn from them, go forward in stride, and we will see you next time on Classroom Hacks. So Pedro, goodbye, farewell.
Thank you, sir. As always, a pleasure to co-podcast with you.
All right, everyone, we'll see you next time.